Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Games I've Got Rid of and Why. Now this is a series of videos where I take a look at games that have previously been in my collection but now for some reason are no longer in my collection, and I'll explain the reasoning behind why I decided to cull them. So let's talk about my first game here is Illusion. Now Illusion is a game, I suppose it's not been amazingly popular despite being from a very popular designer, Wolfgang Warsch, who was famous for making games like The Mind, Taverns of Tiefenthal, Wavelength. This one is quite an interesting and unique card game where you are playing cards out on the table, and these cards are made up of all these different patterns with different colours, and the idea is that you're trying to place cards in order based on the percentages of a certain colour on its coverage of that card. Bit of a weird concept, and it's a real kind of brain tricker as you're trying to carefully align them to put them in the right order, and then when it goes on to the next player, they can either play a new card or they can kind of call your bluff and call you out and thinking that your answer was wrong. And if the person who calls you out is wrong, then you get the point. But if the person who called it out is correct by by saying that you were incorrect by your placement, then they get the point. A really interesting concept that you can play with pretty much anybody. I found that this one was had a bit of a short shelf life because of its almost novelty aspect to the game. I thought it was really cool, really creative, but I found myself wanting to play it less and less as time went by. And it also gives you, personally, it gave me a bit of nausea actually looking at these different images, because it really does mess with your brain. And but some really good, interesting moments as well, where you would be certain that a certain colour had more coverage than another card, and it would actually end up being incorrect. So a fun game, and I would recommend someone check this one out if it does appeal to you. Ultra light, and you can play this with anybody. That one is Illusion. Next up, I have Imhotep. Now, Imhotep is a game I've talked about quite a bit on the show. Particularly, it was on my list of games that I soured on. So I initially really did like this family weight game where you are collecting these stones and putting them on ships and then sending those ships off to different locations, where you would offload them to get different points different ways, such as building pyramids, building obelisks, and things like that. A nice family weight game, again, very easy and low threshold to teach somebody. Looks nice, nice production. The reason why this one ended up kind of falling from grace for me is because I found that the decisions you made and the autonomy really did fall into other players' laps a bit more than I thought, that I personally like. When you load a boat, that's pretty much the end of your turn, which means that the next person would take their action and could easily sail you off to a location that you had no intention of going to. And I understand that's completely the USP of the game. It's what the game's about. It's some people are going to absolutely love that. And initially I did like that, but the more and more I played it, I thought you were so subject to what other people were going to do with you that I kind of started to not appreciate it as much as I did initially. But still, I completely understand why people like this family weight game. It's a solid one from a really good designer, but ultimately I just didn't enjoy it as much as I did. Next up, I have a Stefan Feld game, believe it or not. This one is La Isla. Now, La Isla is a game I enjoy. I think it's a very clever little engine building game, as you are playing cards into different slots, which will determine what those cards do. They can give you like a permanent power, or at least a temporary power. They can decide which resources you gain, or can decide which animal kind of raises up its prestige, which is going to score you points if you collect more of that particular type of animal. And then you're going to be deploying your adventurers onto the board, trying to surround these animals and capture them. I loved the card system in this game, where, as I said, you were getting 3 cards and you were allocating them to different slots to see what you're going to use them for. I thought that was really cool. And when you started getting more cards, you had to cover up existing powers. Really unique concept. I thought this game was really good. I did completely like it, and it barely missed out on my shield of quality. The only reason why this one didn't stay in the collection was because I played it a few times and I thought, that's it. I've kind of experienced what the game has to offer. But for a relatively light game, it's certainly on the lighter end of the Stefan Feld games, probably less than 2.5 in weight, I found that it was quite long. It kind of usually between that 45 minutes and an hour, and I would have liked to have seen it fall more below 30 minutes. If it had done that, I probably would have kept hold of this one, but I just couldn't see myself ever finding the time to drag this one out or pull it off the shelf for an hour game. So not a fault on the gameplay. I thought it was a really solid game and it was a lot of fun, but just a little bit too long for me. Next up, I have a popular two-player game with Jaipur. Now, Jaipur, another game I can appreciate. This one is a kind of a market game where you are collecting different sets of things and selling them off in bonuses or in sets, trying to get bigger bonuses. Really fast and flowing game, or fast-flowing game. Very little downtime, quick decisions. I liked all that stuff. The thing that I found the more and more I played this one was that I thought the decisions were quite obvious in what to do, and not only that. I found that you're a bit of a subject to the card draw a bit too much. So you could often take cards from the centre row of the table, like a kind of a market, and when you did, it would refresh and bring new cards out. And because of the different values of the resources in this one, you've got really cheap leather, or you've got really expensive and lucrative diamonds. You could kind of take all the leather and then it would replenish with all the diamonds, and your opponents would take all the diamonds. So it could very much fall unfavourably on the odd occasion, and I found those odd occasions became more and more frequent the more I played it. But I like the game. I think it's really well designed, perfectly smooth, fun, fast. But I thought the card the luck of the card draw was a bit too strong by the time I was finished with it. So that's why Jaipur didn't stay in the collection. Next up, I have The King is Dead. Now, this is a highly revered game by Peter Sylvester, an area control style game that has some really interesting concepts, particularly in the fact that at the beginning of the game, you've only got 8 cards in your hand, and these are going to determine the actions you can take throughout. But from start to finish, you are never going to replenish your hand. So those 8 actions are all you're going to have through the duration of the whole game, and deciding when to use those cards is an agonising decision. It had a cool concept where you have the 3 different nations, England, Scotland and Wales, I believe, and you don't actually have a particular nation you're controlling. You're trying to either collect the most of a certain type of nation while they're controlling the most regions as well. So you've got to have this clever balance of taking cubes off to get your investment in those nations, but also making sure they're winning the battles. And balancing that can be very difficult. There's so many good things about this game, and it is almost a brilliant design, really, to be honest, from an objective kind of point of view. But I found the fun factor in this game was lacking for me, and I don't know what it is, because I can completely appreciate how clever this was, how well things or the system was ironed out, it's completely streamlined to the core, and for that reason I couldn't give it anything but my shield of quality. I think it's a really rock solid game. But would I pull this game off the shelf and introduce it to new players? Am I going to think that these people are going to enjoy this? I think it's going to be quite a niche to people a niche of people who are going to enjoy this game. And I didn't really see my gaming group being a group who would appreciate what this game has to offer. But still, objectively, a fantastic game, but not one that was going to stay in my collection because it simply wouldn't get played. Next up, I have Kingsburg. Now, Kingsburg is one of the first dice-driven Euro games. This one's a worker placement game where you're placing your dice down in pairs or even bigger than that. And the bigger kind of denominations of dice you put down, you'd get more strong rewards. You're trying to upgrade your little city, try to fight off threats. Another nice game. Has a lot of the things that I tend to like about Euros, but I found I had a few of these games that went on a bit too long because it's not the most complex of games. It's pretty simple in what the game has to offer. Additionally, I started to discover games that were driven by dice a lot. I used to like a lot other games more than this one, like games like Marco Polo, games like Lorenzo, Coimbra. And as more of these games, or as I was discovering more and more of these games, Kingsburg slipped further and further down that list where it simply wouldn't get played. I actually ended up selling this one to a good friend of mine, so I can still play this one if I want to. I like the game. I can certainly see why people do like this game. I still rate it about a 6.5 out of 10, but certainly one that I'd never choose to play anymore because there are so many of that category that I think are better than Kingsburg. Next up, I have Lancaster. Now, Lancaster is actually one of my favourite worker placement games ever. I think it's a brilliant game, still holds my shield of quality. I think it's fantastic. Some really great player interaction here from one of my favourite designers in Matthias Kramer. The reason why this didn't stay in the collection was for a couple of things. The first thing being that I hardly got to play this one. It doesn't play at 2 players, or at least you have to make some quite strong changes to the gameplay in order to play it with 2 players. So, you need at least 3 players to do it. Secondly, I found that the housekeeping in the game become quite a burden. Particularly because I personally like to play with all the modules, all the expansions in the game. You can strip all that out if you want to have a more simple game, which personally I wouldn't find satisfying. So yeah, I like to have so much stuff into it. It did kind of get a little bit bloated. All the phases and housekeeping and just upkeep became a little bit too much of a burden and a bit too cumbersome for me. Now, that didn't take away from the gameplay itself. It has some great decisions here, some great interaction as you're voting on these different laws and things. You're trying to jockey for position to control the worker placement spots by allocating the strongest knights. Has some great area control as you're fighting off these different threats. A fantastic game, really, really brilliant. But in addition to those few little faults I mentioned, I felt like I played this game. I know I played it quite a few times now. I had a bit like some of these other games I've talked about. I've explored everything the game has to offer, and I'm ready to move on to something else because there are so many games out there. So I enjoyed my time at Lancaster. I would still strongly recommend it to worker placement fans, but it wouldn't get off the shelf for me anymore. So that's why Lancaster is no longer in my collection. Next up, I have Lifeboat. Now, Lifeboat is the kind of game that I very rarely play. This one is an absolute ferocious take-that game where you are trying to basically dominate this lifeboat. So the idea is that you've got these different characters on this vessel out to sea, and you are allocated a couple of cards at the beginning of the game. So you've got a personal character which fluctuate in different strength. You've got like very weak ones, but you get more points if you survive, or very strong ones where you get fewer points if you survive. But you're also allocated kind of a person who you love and a person who you hate. So the idea is you're trying to kill the person you hate, but make the person you love survive until the end. And you're going to end up playing cards with each other, trying to kick each other off the ship. You're fighting with other players, using weapons to basically kill each other. It's brutal. There is some really strong player interaction, so which kind of leads into the reason why I personally didn't enjoy it in the end. Was because people could get eliminated very early in the game and have to wait 30, 45 minutes until the game ended, just sitting out with no participation whatsoever. And I think most games nowadays tend to lean away from that. There's not much player interaction, player elimination in games nowadays, at least not to this blunt effect. But still, if you like vicious, in-your-face take-that games, then check Lifeboat out. Very simple, card-driven game, but not my cup of tea and not my taste. Next up, I have Little Circuses. Now, this is a game that's quite interesting. I thought it had a lot of potential. It's not only because of the theme, you're building a little circus up, but this is a tile placement game where you actually have a meeple on your tiles, and you kind of go from location to location, trying to fill up your bleachers of different kind of visitors, get money and stuff, build new tiles, expand your land and such. Pretty good. I felt that the game itself was a little bit underdeveloped. So not only because, to be honest, the gameplay was mostly strong. It was the rulebook and all the symbology and things. There was no consistency. There were some massive oversights in the rulebooks, and that really did drag the game down. It was pretty generic, although there was nothing really wrong with the gameplay. I thought it was pretty generic. But it did have potential of being a good family weight game, but I thought that it had its limitations and it didn't really have the legs to hold up to a lot of the games that come out nowadays. So it was okay, but certainly nothing to write home about, and probably you never heard of this one and will never come across this game. So I'm not going to go too much into this one, just wasn't quite strong enough to hold its own. And the final game I'm going to talk about is London. Now, London is a game by prolific designer Martin Wallace. This one is a card-driven game, as you are kind of building up an engine of different cards. But when you run your engine, you are actually exhausting that whole pile of cards, which is quite interesting. So you're actually kind of building temporary engines. And you also got to weigh up the fact that you have to weigh up the poverty you're going to get by running these engines, because they're going to count as quite significant end game points, which can really falter and kind of restrict your chance of winning the game. Beautifully produced, especially this version by Osprey Games, which is the version I played. I like the game. I'm a Brit. I live in England, so I like games that are set in England. But I thought the game was solid. It was a lot of fun, but I found like the game had too many, kind of a slight rein on it, so it didn't quite have enough to keep me satisfied. It was just I wanted like 30% more complexity, a bit more variation of what the buildings did, because they're all quite similar. So I found that a little bit frustrating, because there was such a clean engine or clean game system that actually ran the game, but the cars themselves just weren't dynamic enough. They weren't interesting enough, and everything was too similar. So it's a shame, because it was very close to being a good game and a game that I enjoyed, but it just didn't quite hook me and sink its claws into my, to keep me satisfied and to keep me going back to this one. So I can see why people like this one again. Pretty light, but still has some good decisions, but just wasn't quite enough for me personally. So that concludes this set of 10 games I've got rid of. If you have enjoyed this review or this video, please hit like and subscribe to my channel, and check out my other videos too. For everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye.